Let's think about designing analytical applications using natural human intelligence process. And this is very important because this is the way that ROI is achieved. It's by mimicking the way people think. It's not by trying to implement a huge software solution. So the first thing that comes up is there's a business question that comes up. And so, in this particular case, the question was, why are margins down? The next thing we do is we start to design metrics. We try to figure out, well, how are we going to measure something in terms of a business question. Following that, we would take some type of action to figure out how we want to visualize that. Is it a graph? Is it a chart? Is it a report? It's that traditional BI view that we want to look at. And finally, we would validate that result through our expert people. And so what ends up happening is this is how people think, and this is how people solve business intelligence problems. So let's take a look at how a business question would come to fruition. Let's use an example of the sales manager, the senior management wanting to look at sales, for instance. They want to understand sales by region. So what happens is that they need to know that information, and they're going to ask that particular question, and the collaboration goes to the people, the longtime subject matter experts we talked about earlier, who end up designing the metrics, followed by the DBAs and the statisticians, who are the ones who develop and calculate the algorithms that we would be using in order to measure sales. And then finally, we would go to the accountants to validate that, in fact, these are the numbers that we should be looking at. So solving the business problem follows a continuum like this. So for those of you who are familiar with software development, this looks a heck of a lot like an agile sprint, and that's exactly where I'm going with it. So if you could take a 2-week sprint, for instance, and instead of trying to solve your entire business problem in one fell swoop, you did it in a sprint, you could answer these business questions one at a time. Nobody can answer all the business questions that are in a 35-page document all at the same time. So question, we need insight into sales estimates. Right, we need to see them by region, we need to see them by rep. We start to communicate and we memorialize this information. We start to work with the people designing the metrics. This is how we want the formula to be. We need invoice clients, etc. The visualization, we want to take a look at it as a bar chart, pie chart, whatever. And then finally, all these figures are within alignment. And then we would push that out to a BI solution and allow people to look at this. So being able to mimic the human thought process is part of becoming successful in terms of a BI implementation. What collaboration looks like within a BI system is something like this. It's kind of like a social media thing that would drop down where people could talk about these particular KPIs you see here. This map, for instance, why are these certain dots yellow, which represents bad. We could talk about individual sales offices, etc. So the communications are captured as data within the BI system, and this facilitates communication. Remember when I first started, I said that most of the BI projects fail because of lack of communication. This is how you work with development and with the end users to actually figure out what information they want to see. When you look at a typical waterfall implementation, and this is where we start to get more detail on hard cost savings, we look at something like this. This is a typical implementation of a BI project. It looks a heck of a lot like a software project, which I mentioned earlier. The first part of any implementation is taken up by analysis, design, and coming up with some kind of project plan. And the next thing is that you give it to your developers and they start to construct SSIS packages, SSAS, etc. All sorts of data construction goes on. They start testing that system. They find errors in it. There's unplanned work that needs to be done. It goes to client acceptance, and eventually it's implemented. You have the data part of it. Now you start to put the visualization dashboards on top of that. Clients test it. Hopefully they don't find anything that requires additional data construction, because if it does, we go back and start this cycle over again, and at the end of the day we deploy it. Problem is that there's a large separation from the time that we actually started answering this question and the time that we actually delivered the software. Many of the people could have changed on the team over the course of the time. Well, part of what Halo does, our software platform, is that we minimize the amount of time it takes to do that data construction, and we build the visualization dashboards as the tools to validate the data that's in there. And that's the 2-week sprint that I showed you, or that sprint diagram. So what ends up happening is we have significantly less time to build it. It also requires fewer resources. Again, another a measure of ROI. One of the biggest cost savings you're going to gain from BI is being able to implement it more quickly than not, because I'll show you in just a minute how much that actually costs. Using Halo, we can shorten the traditional waterfall implementation in half, development time by 2/3, unplanned work by 2/3, and by doing the dashboards in parallel, we can save another 60% in time. Now, here's the problem when you do a traditional rollout of a BI project. You have about 18 different skill sets that work on a project like this over the course of the time. It starts out with a project lead and a project manager. You start to add your database resources, your SSIS resources, then your testing resources, etc. And a project can take 18 months and almost 3,000 hours to implement. This isn't unusual. Now, these are units of time. If it's a smaller project, you could say it's 18 weeks, or it could be a year. It doesn't really matter. The point here is that over this prolonged time period while you're doing implementation, you're paying all of these people to be working on this project. So you have a burn rate of somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 per month until this BI project is implemented, not even counting the cost of the initial software. So in this example, the project would cost about $250,000 to implement. If you can reduce the number of resources and reduce the amount of time, it's obvious that it's going to be much cheaper. In this particular case, if we got the project out in half the time with fewer people, it would only take us 894 hours. Well, then our total cost to implement would be about $76,000 to implement. What ends up happening is that there are ways that we can use agile development to reduce that cost even more. And this is where a lot of your ROI is going to come in. If instead of using a traditional waterfall method, you end up using an agile method, you can start to do sprints, whether they're a month long or a week long. It depends on how agile your team really is. And if they can start to put out dashboards immediately that can be used to change your business processes and start to generate revenue, if that's your key indicator, sooner, then you can start to pay back your investment while you're in the development phase. When you take a look at cost, the reason it adds up so quickly is that it really has to do with the length of time that you're developing. So this kind of shows the cost of the two different methods. And by doing this, you can see you can save 70%. So there are two things that are adding up here. One is the number of resources you have on it, but on top of that, it's the length of time these resources are working. This list kind of goes through a traditional BI implementation and the type of skill sets that are required. And you'll see with our product, it takes less. Let's take a look at the initial labor payback, just on the implementation part of it. So if you are a $100 million company and you're experiencing 10% growth and you think that you can move the needle by 1/10 of a point, and I'll show you that in a second, what ends up happening is that you could pay back your investment of a short development cycle in about 9 months. So you purchase the software within a year and a half, you've paid back the implementation time. When it takes you 18 months to deploy it, your payback is much longer. In this particular case, it would take you 36 months to pay back your initial investment. And that's what traditionally people are finding. But if you use a agile method to do the implementation, what happens is that the payback happens much sooner, and essentially, if you work very effectively, you could possibly pay back the investment that you have in the BI project by the time the full thing was implemented. Here are some key metrics, and again, this is about ROI, so here's some key metrics that all businesses share. This takes a look, again, this is from the Aberdeen Hart-Hanks study that takes a look at profitability and revenue growth of the top companies who use BI versus average companies. Last year, 2011, manufacturing revenue grew 7.5%. Non-manufacturing revenue grew 2.1%. So these numbers are very optimistic. But let's just say on average your company was growing 10%. Wouldn't it be nice if you could use BI to get to that 40 to 41% profit margin? If you could, that would be a tremendous payback in terms of implementing BI. And that's really the goal of BI, is to move the needle on this particular metric. So assume that you have a $100 million company, you're achieving 10% profit growth, and you move that needle just by 10% of what's possible. Well, that would add $300,000 to your bottom line. If you're, and you can multiply these numbers, they scale right up. So if you're a $500,000 company, $500 million company, just multiply that by 5. Notice that we didn't go all the way to the top. We just improved it by a minute amount. Well, what's happened is that your ROI on your BI investment is 100% in the first year, simply by giving people dashboards and KPIs where they can effectively collaborate together and make better business decisions, essentially taking those 15 million decisions and making better ones. In the long term, you have even a higher ROI because you've paid for the implementation in year 1. Here's another key metric that all businesses share: customer retention. It is significantly more expensive to get a new customer than it is to maintain an existing customer. So if you can increase your customer retention by just 1%, in your $100 million company, that is worth $1 million to your top line revenue. So imagine having metrics that talk about customer satisfaction, getting those out to your end users, having them collaborate about that, making that their goal every day. Imagine how much more profitable your company could be if they didn't have to lose the customers that they lose each year and instead just added new customers. Your ROI in the first year would be somewhere on the order of 6.5 times your cost of implementing a BI solution if this was what you were trying to measure. I'd like to show you one more example, which is kind of interesting. This is employee retention. The award-winning companies report that they have an average turnover rate of about 11%, and that's significantly less than the average turnover rate of 38% that is reported by the U.S. Department of Labor. The interesting thing here is that these employees are knowledge workers, and how hard is it for you to rehire and train one of the key knowledge workers that you have in your company if they leave? You can't just plug somebody in like you can at Walmart with the example I gave about the checkout stands. So the ROI of employee retention based on well-implemented BI is extremely high. I mean, if you save just 2 employees during the course of a year, you could look at a $250,000 savings in ramp-up time and lost productivity cost. Now, why do employees leave? Well, they leave because of high levels of frustration. It's because they're searching for data, they can't get to the data, they can't do their jobs right, and eventually they throw in the towel. The other reason that employees leave is that the company's not profitable and morale is low. And why is that happening? It's because people aren't collaborating on the key metrics. Again, that's a business intelligence solution that, if implemented correctly, helps keep and retain employees. Such an important thing, and a lot of us forget about how important it is to maintain all of those knowledge workers, because that's really your corporate IP. Without these people making decisions for you, and driving your company forward, you can pretty much know that you're going to be struggling in business next year. And again, the ROI is extremely high on maintaining additional employees. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining the webinar, and I hope I showed you a couple of different ways that you can look at ROI. First would be the time to deployment, a very important thing, the initial cost in terms of the number of people that you need to put on a team to implement these things, and finally, using effective KPIs and being able to communicate about those.